The image of the dancer in the Caledonia Victims Project logo is a tribute to a 14-year-old girl named Pam Dudich who loved to dance before her world turned upside down. Pam lives on the 6th line in Caledonia. The OPP withdrew policing from her street on April 20th, 2006, after hundreds of native occupiers attacked them while they were trying to enforce a court order. Police were injured after being attacked with clubs, crowbars, axes, a chainsaw, and socks filled with rocks. And before I go on, I just want to tell you that all of the evidence, all the citations for every fact that I'm reciting tonight is going to be at helpless.blatchford.ca, and you'll be able to download all the documents yourself. It's on your program. The court order was supposed to end an illegal occupation of a new subdivision across the street from Pam's house, known as the Douglas Creek Estates, which began on February 28, 2006. Lawlessness escalated over time as it became clear to the occupiers that they were immune from the law. The worst of the violence occurred after May 3rd, 2006, when the former Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services, Monty Quinter, acceded to the militants' demand not to call in the Canadian Forces to protect Caledonia. That's his letter that he sent. So far, Native protesters have burned down a bridge and threatened to kill firefighters, attacked an elderly couple in their car, attacked journalists, assaulted and threatened residents, police, and one another, destroyed the area's hydro station, thrown a vehicle over a bridge, blocked the town's main roads and rail lines, attempted to murder a police officer, polluted the environment with tire and grass fires, extorted money from non-native landowners, and left a builder with permanent brain damage after beating him nearly to death in the home he was building for his daughter. In 2007, the CBC produced a documentary based on the 1,000+ hours of audio recordings of radio transmissions in our possession, proving that occupiers had actually authorized the shooting of civilians and police, among other depravities. It was pulled half an hour before airing, and the CBC still refuses to air it. We first met Pam Dudich and her family in March 2007. She'd produced a heartbreaking pamphlet for a school project. She called it Road of Hope, Help the 6th Line. And she wanted, and her family wanted, the world to hear her words of pain. So we took her to Queen's Park to share her story at a news conference. Not a single journalist interviewed her afterwards.
For 14 years, I've been living on this road, and that's how long I've been alive. But only 13 years have been happy years. Ever since February 28, 2006, my whole life changed. Having to be almost literally locked inside my own home, I was terrified to even look out my own window. Close your eyes and imagine. You're looking out your own laundry room window, and you see the tall, beautiful oak trees on your neighbor's property. But when you look higher up, you see the darkest, biggest plume of smoke you have ever seen. You run into the living room to look out that window and find almost 50 cars lining up and down your streets, with natives walking everywhere. They're pulling in your driveway, not even on the right side of the road. You even see a 12-year-old driving a car past, but you can't do anything. You can't call the police because they can't help you. You're locked in your own home. A few days later, when it calms down, you have to go to school. But you can't get to school by bus anymore. You have to drive a 30-minute ride to school when it only took 2 minutes. Unless you went through the blockade. But you could only do this if you had a pass. But even when we got one, it was whether they felt like letting you through or not. If they did let you go, it was like you were in prison. Gates were everywhere. Men with masks over their faces, only to see their eyes. Men holding bats, some even with guns. It was a living hell. I had to live through that. You don't know what life is like until you have to live through it. I'm a competitive dancer, and I love to dance outside on the side lawn. But I wasn't able to do it unless I could make take the pressure of getting stares or firecrackers thrown at me. Now I take medication and go to counseling because of all this. A 14-year-old should not be doing this. It's these things that hurt, because it's not just my family in pain, it's all of ours on the 6th line. There are 7 children on this road, ranging from 10 months to 15 years old. It's very sad when the 14 and 15-year-old are told that if ever a Native came into our house and tried hurting us and we defended ourselves by fighting back, we would be the ones being arrested, not the Native. People in Caledonia think it's quiet on the 6th line, but they have it all wrong. It's nothing like that. People on the 6th line have not had a good night's sleep for over a year now. That's sad. This is why we need your help. I'm 14 years old, and I will fight with as much power as I have to get police back on my road. I know Mr. Peterson made the mistake of taking it away and it's sad when he can't fix it on his own, but I, a 14-year-old girl, is trying.
Thank you.
Pam has to take medication and go to counseling. We'll talk about that later. Pam's mother showed me the past that Natives forced them to carry, as well as a photo of 2 of the 7 deer carcasses hung by occupiers on a lamp pole near their home between October and December 2006, where kids on the school bus could see them. Her diary entry for October 30th at 3:50 p.m. notes this about the 5th carcass. Quote, "Between yesterday at 1:30 and now, the deer was taken down, skinned, and beheaded, and then hung back up. Mayor called." Quote, "Her mom wrote me saying, quote, seeing the deer each time gave you a sickening feeling in your gut." Another Caledonia resident asked me to share one of his experiences. Quote, "The police and firemen were hiding behind my fence while a group of Natives, brackets, terrorists, were lighting a fire behind my house. They said to my neighbor and myself, 'We cannot protect you or touch them.' We were and are still treated as shit by the police. My trust in our system is gone forever." OPP testimony at the trial for the Brown-Chatwell lawsuit, which was heard and later cited by Christy Blatchford in Helpless, confirms the Haldeman OPP commander was ordered not to arrest rioting Natives, whom he said were emboldened by the lack of police response. Residents were forced to stand guard one night at the home of a 92-year-old World War II veteran named Jack Dancy because OPP officers refused to stop Native occupiers from throwing rocks at his house. And you're going to hear from a speaker, the former mayor of Haldeman tonight. She was there that night and she saw it with her own eyes. This war hero later showed me one of the rocks and cheerfully told me, quote, "I spent 5 years in hell for this country. And now I don't even know if the police will protect me. It wasn't worth it." In 2010, Pam's mother shared her feelings about the return of the OPP to the 6th line. 4 years after they were abandoned by their police. Quote, "We have lost 4 years of our lives, which we will never get back. I feel like Canada has let us down big time. For a land that is supposed to be free, we are prisoners of war who have been left to deal with this predicament on our own. As for policing back down here, yes, it's true. Do we feel any safer? No. False accusations of being white supremacists are common against non-Native victims and activists, including for this event. Intimidation has also included physical assaults and death and torture threats. This charming cartoon here is typical. Are you white? Are you a complete failure? Do you want to avoid responsibility for your failure? Then citizens of Caledonia, become a white supremacist. The guy on the left says, "I'm a bigot, I hate Indians." And the guy with the swastika on his chest says, "Duh, my mom is white, Caledonia is white." That's Jeff Parkinson, Gary McHale, after being in the hospital. After Gary McHale was sent to hospital in December 2007, the former OPP commissioner was photographed sharing a joke with the Native man who led the attack. But he refused Mayor Trainor's September 2009 request to meet with the 6th line residents, which would have included Pam Dudich's family. 4 non-natives have been arrested for trying to raise a Canadian flag near the occupation site. I'm one of them. 3 of them are actually, 2 of them here. A Caledonia resident, a police officer, who criticized Ontario's premier, faced a Police Services Act charge after a government negotiator complained to the OPP, who in turn filed a complaint with the Hamilton Police Services. It was held to be unfounded. In Mr. McHale's case, the OPP repeatedly targeted him for defamation and false arrests, a campaign that resulted in charges of obstructing justice against the present commissioner and a superintendent, and a charge of influencing municipal official against the former commissioner, Fantino. OPP officers have even visited hall owners to intimidate them into canceling room rental agreements so we could not speak. It is difficult to convey to you the absolute terror, hopelessness, trauma, and sense of betrayal the people of Caledonia feel to this day. Perhaps it's enough to tell you that Pam Dudich must take medication and go to counseling. Pam's mother takes medication for her diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and has attempted suicide. Pam's father has had a heart attack. The family business is in ruins, and they can't leave because they can't sell their home. This sign is from the Sterling Street subdivision, where Native occupiers burned down the bridge and left Sam Galtieri with brain damage from their vicious beating. The words heartless and cruel seem inadequate to describe the irony of a situation wherein an organized group from one race of people terrorized others with racial slurs, fire, violence, vandalism, and property seizures, and then tormented their victims with false accusations of being white supremacists. As the son of parents who lived in Nazi-occupied Holland, I am offended to the very core of my being by the blaming of innocent victims for racially motivated crimes against them. I am also offended that Six Nations people have also been unintended victims of the same racist policing policies that allow illegal occupations to escalate and the sites to become lawless, quote, home-free zones, as residents in Caledonia and Ipperwash refer to them. Occupation sites have been the scene rapes, assaults, arson, drug use, and gun violence. A Six Nations newspaper confirmed that the shooter of a Six Nations man at a nearby smoke shack had been on the occupation site near the homes of residents, threatening another over a drug debt with an AK-47 rifle just prior to the shooting. A resident went out and notified an OPP officer, but he refused to enter the site, and a Native man was later shot in the arm when he emptied his magazine. In August 2007, another Six Nations paper cited former Six Nations Chief David General's opinion that, quote, he does not consider the occupation site sacred land, citing 2 reported rapes and several other unseemly acts which have been reported from the reclamation site, unquote. In both Ipperwash and Caledonia, ironically, original occupiers have expressed fear over the lawlessness that developed in the aftermath of their own lawless takeovers. So where do we go from here? This drawing, which we first presented in September 2008 to Brantford Council and later to the OPP, is in your handout. It's on page 2. It's called Reconciliation, the Cairney's Path. We must commit to a path of truth, justice, and apologies from Six Nations, from the OPP, and the Ontario government. There are no shortcuts. There are no alternatives. If the Government of Canada can, rightly, apologize for residential schools, then these groups can apologize for Caledonia. Unfortunately, 5 months after the release of Helpless, the present OPP Commissioner has not even read the book, nor has the Haldimand Detachment Commander. As we finally begin to talk about victims and solutions, we must also acknowledge that those who terrorize Caledonia do not represent the good people of Six Nations or Aboriginal people in general. Thank you. That's the end of part 1.
Mostly stand behind them.
Question period's at the end. Thank you. Now we're going to talk about Caledonia myths and policy issues. Now that we've discussed Caledonia's victims, let's address some of the key myths and policy issues that need to be exposed and addressed. Vexatious land claims. The Six Nations people are not, as many would have you believe, indigenous to Canada. They lived in the area south of the Great Lakes in what is now the United States. When they were
if you can't be polite, you'll have to leave. Shut up!
I wonder why they're so desperate to silence the voices of the victims. For 5 years, this is what we've had to deal with. You're seeing it up close now. It's shameful. It's shameful. Shameful. If I were an Aboriginal speaker talking about being victimized and talking on behalf of other people, I just can't believe that anybody in this audience would actually interrupt while we're talking. I just can't believe that. So let's go on. Let's try and go on here. So the Six Nations people are not indigenous to Canada. They lived in the area south of the Great Lakes in what is now the United States. When they were dispossessed of their lands after the American Revolutionary War, the Crown rewarded them for their service as loyal allies by purchasing the Haldimand Tract from the Mississauga Indians as a refuge for them as per the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784. The Six Nations people were treated honorably by a grateful Crown. Canada did not steal land from them, it bought it for them, so they could settle here in safety. Six Nations later surrendered large portions of the tract for sale. The federal government has stated that these surrenders were valid, and it does not recognize the Douglas Creek Estates in Caledonia as a valid land claim. According to 3 different Superior Court judges who have ruled against 3 other illegal occupations in Cayuga, Hagersville, and Brantford, the recognized representatives of Six Nations have not made any claim for possession or return of the Haldimand Tract, and such a claim would not succeed even if they did. The only claim Six Nations have made is for monetary compensation that may be owing. In 2010, a Superior Court judge granted Brantford an injunction against violent occupations that were destroying the city's economy. After reviewing a report on the Haldimand Tract land transfers by an expert from the Ipperwash inquiry named Joan Holmes and the related documents, the judge ruled as follows, quote, "For more than 150 years, the Six Nations did nothing to indicate to innocent third-party purchasers that there was any problem with title to their lands. Property has been bought and sold over that time, period. The Six Nations did commence a claim in 1995 against the federal and provincial governments seeking compensation, but never for return of the land. Still, there was no notice to private landowners when that action was commenced or after of any problem with their title. It was not until this case commenced that the Six Nations claimed to have the right to control the activities of private landowners on the basis that the private land within the city of Brantford belonged to the Six Nations. I conclude such an argument must fail." 3 separate Superior Court judges. Despite the vacuous nature of their claims, Native lawbreakers were able to create a cascade of benefits for themselves. In a letter dated April 17, 2006, the provincial and federal governments attempted to bribe the occupiers to end their occupation with offers that included the transfer of 380 acres of land from a former correctional facility, which was done, the possibility of even more land transfers, research funding for land and resource issues, and funds for, quote, public education regarding land claims. In September 2008, the Turtle Island News excuse me, reported details of an audit showing that in 1 year, Six Nations received $1,131,382 for negotiations, some of which was paid to members of the Haudenosaunee Development Institute, HDI, and the Haudenosaunee Men's Fire, HMF, who were involved in illegal occupations and intimidating non-native landowners. In other words, the Ontario government's paying money to the people responsible for the lawlessness in Caledonia. Between 2006 and 2007, Brian Jesse Porter, who would eventually be charged for pulling a stolen hydro tower across Caledonia's main road on December 1st, 2007, received $131,240, as stated by Ontario's Ministry of Finance in its Public Accounts of Ontario report. Caledonia is a national security issue. What has never been admitted publicly,
Excuse me. Look, I'm just warning you one more time. If you don't want to be quiet, we'll have you escorted. It's your choice. I'm asking you to be polite. We're all here to see this presentation. If you don't want to see it, you can leave. If you interrupt one more time, we'll have you escorted out. Just be polite.
You might learn something. What has never been admitted publicly by the OPP or Ontario government is that Native criminals are being aided by a coalition of anarchists, radical unionists, and anti-Israel groups led by an anarchist named Tom Kiefer from Local 3903 of the Canadian Union of Public Employees at York University. Tom Kiefer and CUPE 3903, with help from other locals from CUPE, CAW, OPSU, CEP, and USW, United Steelworkers, began supporting Aboriginal militants in Caledonia after the failed OPP raid of April 20th, 2006, when police were driven off the occupation site after being attacked with weapons. By this time, according to OPP testimony at the Brown-Chatwell trial, the Caledonia occupation site was taken over by the Mohawk warriors, which police considered to be, quote, akin to Hell's Angels, a group which was involved in organized crime, cigarette running, with a reputation for physical confrontation and access to guns, including assault rifles. The warriors murdered Quebec Police Corporal Marcel Lemay in Oka, and they were in Ipperwash during the violent takeover of the Canadian Forces base there, which led to the death of Dudley George and further intimidation of the residents. In addition to supporting the warriors, Kiefer states in a November 15, 2009 report, his coalition is, quote, working closely with the Haudenosaunee Men's Fire, HMF. On April 3rd, 2009, the Superior Court judge ruling against the HMF illegal occupation in Hagersville said that they had engaged in, quote, extortion, intimidation, nuisance, trespass, and inducing breach of contract. Members of CUPE 3903 were, according to the report, quote, present on the barricades when Six Nations militants blockaded the major Highway 6 bypass around Caledonia for 4 days in April 2008, and they actually contributed financially to this illegal action. Kiefer and CUPE work with the anarchist Black Cross Federation and the Fredonia Anarchist Foundation. In his report, Kiefer states Fredonia donated $3,000 to CUPE, $1,000 of which was funneled to Jim Windle, a reporter with Tekowanaka News on Six Nations, who published articles trying to smear us as white supremacists. After we filed a lawsuit, the Teka's publisher printed a clarification saying it had no evidence. This is a Six Nations paper that smeared us as white supremacists, said they had no evidence we were associated with white supremacist groups. Fredonia also gave money to an anti-capitalist newsletter in Toronto called Basics. Editor Steve De Silva was an invited speaker at a Kiefer/CUPE June 23, 2009 anti-Caledonia protest in Cayuga. Basics' MySpace page provides a list of his heroes, include Mao Zedong, Marx, Lenin, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Malcolm X, and the Black Panther Party. Friends of Basics include Free Palestine, which uses a logo showing Che Guevara under the slogan Palestina Libre. This is a picture of the Palestinian flag flying on the occupied Douglas Creek estates, along with both the Six Nations and the Mohawk Warriors flag. It was placed there by the Niagara Palestinian Association on May 3rd, 2006. This is the Vice President of the Canadian Arab Federation, Ali Mallah, in a 2006 protest, walking beside someone carrying a Mohawk warrior flag and another carrying the portrait of Hassan Nasrallah, leader of the terror group Hezbollah. On November 27, 2006, the Canadian Arab Federation petitioned the Canadian government to have both Hezbollah and Hamas removed from the list of terror organizations. This is another picture of Canadian Arab Federation Vice President Ali Mallah speaking beside the Mohawk warrior flag. This picture shows the warrior flag with an anti-Israel poster depicting the Israel Defense Forces as heartless murderers intentionally dropping a bomb on a child and a Jew as a hooded executioner. Another group active in supporting the lawlessness in Caledonia is the Christian peacemaker teams. The UN has condemned the Hamas charter for laying out, quote, a blueprint for jihadist terrorism, unquote, directed at killing Jews and destroying the state of Israel. But the CPT's FAQ page for their Palestine mission portrays Hamas as a humanitarian organization. At the June 2009 anti-Caledonia protest, one of Kiefer's invited speakers expressed his solidarity with those wearing logos of the Tamil Tigers terror group. In a paper entitled Declaring the Exception, Direct Action, Six Nations, and the Struggle in Brantford, Tom Kiefer laid out a plan showing how economic warfare against Brantford could force the government to grant Native militants an area not subject to Canadian law. That's what he said. A second way for Six Nations to win is if they can escalate their blockades in a manner that continues to financially hurt the city of Brantford, while also making clear that attempts at police or military intervention would be costly and impractical means of resolving the situation. By escalating direct action tactics and mobilizing a larger number of people from Six Nations, this approach might force the city of Brantford to recognize Six Nations land rights and sovereignty through some kind of wide-ranging and innovative agreement with the Confederacy and the HDI. Those are the groups responsible for all the lawlessness in Caledonia. According to MPP Toby Barrett, communities within the Haldeman Tract have suffered an estimated $4.1 billion, with a B, dollars in economic losses due to this lawlessness. Six Nations councillor Helen Miller, in a letter written to the Brantford Expositor, July 14, 2009, said the people of Six Nations are, quote, fed up with the protests and fed up with these groups of people and individuals claiming to speak for them. She goes on to say, as for who represents Six Nations, let me put it this way. The Mohawk workers, women of the Mohawk Nation, the Men's Fire, or individuals like Stephen Boots Powless, who terrorized Brantford, or Ruby and Floyd Montour, who terrorized everybody, were not elected, appointed, or authorized by the people of Six Nations to be their representatives or to speak on their behalf. Nor is the Haudenosaunee Development Institute, the HDI, supported by the elected council or the community at large. Nevertheless, Kiefer and CUPE continue to bring non-native radicals into Caledonia to support these groups. Despite being forewarned that they were bussing in people to disrupt our February 27th Truth and Reconciliation rally, that was the monument we were trying to put up, the OPP refused to provide officers to separate them from us, refused to prevent them from trespassing on the private property we were forced to relocate to, and watched as we were screamed at, assaulted, and set up for bogus assault charges. I'm so glad these guys are here today, so you're going to get a little taste of it. One of the two shocked observers from the International Free Press Society present that day said, quote, I didn't feel as though I was in Canada. Make no mistake about it. Caledonia is the front line for extreme left-wing radicals who are using native crime groups as proxies for their own anti-capitalist, anarchist mission to undermine the rule of law in Canada. Let's talk about an illegal peacekeeping mission on Canadian soil. The Ipperwash inquiry includes 4 recommendations which suggest the OPP, other police forces, and the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services enact so-called peacekeeping policing policies during Aboriginal disputes. Both the Premier of Ontario and the former Commissioner of the OPP have referred to the OPP role in Caledonia as that of being peacekeepers. On May 2nd, 2007, the Premier actually joked on TV about having to issue blue helmets to the OPP. The obscenity of this joke is underscored when one reviews a list of countries where UN peacekeepers are currently deployed: Liberia, Ivory Coast, Haiti, Sudan, Lebanon, East Timor, Kosovo, Chad, and the Congo. The UN says this about the role of peacekeeping in restoring the rule of law in failed states. The rule of law is the legal and political framework under which all persons and institutions, including the state itself, are accountable. Establishing respect for the rule of law is fundamental to achieving a durable peace in the aftermath of conflict. Laws need to be publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and be consistent with international human rights norms and standards. Peacekeeping works to strengthen police, justice, and corrections institutions, as well as the institutions that hold them accountable. Since 1999, all major peacekeeping operations and many special political missions have had provisions to work with the host country to strengthen the rule of law. Obviously then, peacekeeping missions are not deployed to undermine the rule of law in stable democracies by withholding law enforcement protection from innocent civilians to appease armed aggressors of a favored race. Strangely, not one politician or journalist has ever thought to ask some seemingly obvious questions. Number one, who has the authority to authorize a peacekeeping mission on Canadian soil? 2, what legal authority exists for substituting a peacekeeping policy in place of the legal protections of the Charter of Rights and Ontario's Police Services Act during any land claim, let alone an imaginary one? And number 3, if Canadian citizens in Caledonia have so much in common with those in failed states such as Haiti, Darfur, Kosovo, and Liberia that they require a peacekeeping mission, why have our federal and provincial governments turned blind eyes to their plight? Now let's take a brief look at the dangerously flawed process used by the Ipperwash inquiry to arrive at those peacekeeping recommendations. It is commonly believed that the Ipperwash inquiry studied how to prevent violence during land claims. This would be a reasonable assumption, given it was sitting during the height of the violence in Caledonia. Unfortunately, it did not. The inquiry only examined how to prevent police violence against Native protesters. It did not allow the issue of Native violence against...
They killed a Native guy. What do you expect them to talk about? A sniper killed the dude. What do you expect them to talk about? I'm just saying, they killed an unarmed Native guy. What do you expect them to I know you're all about the okay with it, but I'm not. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Christine.
I just want to say thanks for having us. It's
Ladies and gentlemen, that is what a real police force looks like. After everything you've seen tonight, is that not the most shameful, disgusting thing you have ever seen? After all these innocent human beings, you just heard about Native women being raped. You've heard about little girls taking medication, heart attacks, suicides, and they just don't care. They want what they want, and that's it. Anyway, so let's finish. The inquiry, the Ipperwash inquiry, only examined how to prevent police violence against Native protesters. It did not allow the issue of Native violence against innocent Ipperwash residents to be studied, even though they were victims of a vexatious land claim, does that sound familiar, against their homes filed in 1992, which marked the beginning of a reign of terror similar, almost identical to that in Caledonia. You never heard about that. Despite their nightmare, out of 139 witnesses at the Ipperwash inquiry, not one resident was allowed to testify. The evidence of their suffering went unentered into the record and unnoticed by the media. During the 3 years that the inquiry was in session, non-natives were granted a total of a mere 90 minutes with the commissioner, which took place at a single town hall meeting on June 21st, 2006, at the height of the violence in Caledonia, and the minutes of that meeting were sanitized. This is why, out of 100 recommendations, not one is specifically directed at the prevention of Native violence against innocent residents. To conclude, the Ontario government knows full well the Ipperwash inquiry did not allow the vital issue of Native violence against residents to be studied, yet it continues to use its skewed recommendations to justify the wholesale subversion of the protection non-natives are entitled to under the Police Services Act and the Canadian Charter of Rights. And it continues to allow criminals, anarchists, and the OPP to victimize them, all under cover of phony land claims and an illegal peacekeeping mission on Canadian soil. In my opinion, Caledonia represents an ongoing crime against democracy that must be ended, and it must be ended now. Thank you. I just have to say, at the risk of getting beaten up for going over time, in 2006, after we were arrested for trying to put up a Canadian flag, and we were about to try to do it again, so we fully expected to go back to jail. We were talking, Gary and I were talking about, and I said, you know, when this is over, if we're still alive, because he'd been threatened with death several times, I said, if we're still alive and we're out of jail, everything else is bonus. And to have you people in the room tonight, thank you. Thank you. Gary McHale will discuss our proposed Caledonia Act recommendations in part four. But first, be prepared to be shocked. You haven't seen anything yet. By the smoking gun evidence of corruption within the OPP and Ontario's Ministry of the Attorney General. And I wish I had all night to tell you what a privilege it has been to stand by this man's side for 4.5 years. And to his wife, Christine, who did the same, and my wife, thank you so much. Thank you. Gary McHale.